So I kind of grew up under leasing desks and, kind of grew up with the business as a sort of sibling, so to speak, and not as favorable a sibling as my actual sibling. So did not love the business. I felt like it was competition to a degree. Competition for my father's attention, competition for resources and energy.
Your initial taste of your dad being in property management was positive as a kid.
Yeah.
And I imagine that changed because you got into the business. What was that? What was that like?
Kicking and screaming. No. So
Ian Mattingly grew up under leasing desks, watching his father build a real estate empire. But he took his own path, from building websites to managing a car sales team. His journey was anything but typical. When the market shifted, so did he, returning to multifamily with fresh vision and strategy. As president of Luma Residential, he's not just carrying on a legacy. He's redefining it with his ability to zoom in on details and zoom out to see the future, balancing the needs of residents, employees, and investors in an industry where decisions impact people's homes and lives.
So growing up, your dad started this company. What was your position financially?
we went back and forth for sure. We were very much subject to the whims of the real estate cycle. We definitely had some of those, like to refer to as the powdered milk years, when things were tough. But I would say there were more ups than downs, and I think we had a pretty privileged upbringing. There were not many 16, 17-year-olds that can boast 4 or 5 countries on their passport before age 18.
Now you're president.
Yeah.
What was that journey like?
What was it like? That's a very broad question.
Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Excited to chat.
Likewise.
So where I want to start today is I want to understand a little bit about your early years. So where you grew up, a little bit about your family, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
So I'm a Dallasite, born and bred, one of the few. And I grew up in a leafy suburban part of North Dallas, not too far from a reservoir. We don't have any natural lakes. A lot of people don't realize this. North Texas has no natural lakes. Everything that looks like a lake is an old, cattle pond or some sort of reservoir. So I grew up not far from one called White Rock Lake. And so that was kind of our main recreation, is get on bikes. And it was a pretty steep hill. We'd cruise down the hill to White Rock Lake and bike around the lake or fish for catfish or do all that kind of stuff.
Very outdoorsy background.
Yeah, I mean,
Upbringing.
pre-internet. So what else were we gonna do? Go to the park and kick the soccer ball around. My elementary school was walking distance, so walk to school most days. So yeah, I think you could say it was kind of an idyllic childhood for sure.
And what about did you have siblings? Do you have siblings?
I do, yeah. I have a sister. She's 4 years younger. And I think she's finally got over the fact that, she had an older sibling that came first and had to do everything first. So
what was your relationship like growing up, and how's it changed?
I think I thought I was supposed to do the protective big brother thing. But I'm not innately a physical person. And frankly, we didn't go to the same school for very long because of the age difference between us. So it's always like we had 1 year of overlap, and then I would be on to the next thing, and she'd still be there for another 3 years, and then we'd do that again. So I think we had pretty separate lives growing up. We annoyed each other endlessly. I think we've become pretty good siblings. We're good communicators and, help each other out.
So growing up, what did your parents do for work?
So the company I run now is the company my father started in 1984. I was 5 years old. So I kind of grew up under leasing desks and, in back offices. I remember one summer I was pretty young, single digits. We had a property in Houston that wasn't performing particularly well, so we moved into an apartment in Houston, spent the summer in Houston, which is not an experience I recommend unless you're like somebody who really likes humidity. And, kind of grew up with the business as a sort of sibling, so to speak, and not as favorable a sibling as my actual sibling. So did not love the business. I felt like it was competition to a degree.
What does that mean? What do you mean competition?
Competition for my father's attention, competition for resources and energy. And my mother was floated between jobs, worked for the Jewish Community Center, did marketing, sometimes was a stay-at-home mom. So it was quite variable.
Did you grow up religious?
If by religious you mean going to Sunday school and all that stuff, I did those things. But no, I would not consider myself observant then or now.
So I guess talk to me a little bit more. When you say competing for your father's attention, what was that like in practice? So he would be spending like weekdays and weekends on the business, and
he was building a business. I mean, you know what that's like. It can be all consuming if you let it be. And particularly given, he started the business in 1984. In 1986, tax laws changed. SNL failed. Then you had the RTC crisis. So it was not only building a business, but it was building a business that was responding to a generational crisis in real estate and in residential real estate specifically, and in North Texas even more specifically. So, it was chaos, and obviously chaos produces opportunities, but it takes a lot of energy in order to capitalize on those. Obviously, he was successful in that, but yeah, it was a drain sometimes.
What did your dad do before starting the business in 1984?
It's kind of an interesting story. It's one I really like to tell. So my father graduated from university with a degree in economics into the worst job market in 50 years, and ended up moving with my mother to Colorado. They had met in college and gotten married, or started dating. Didn't get married till they moved to Colorado, but they moved to Colorado, and the only job he could find was as a foreman on a boxcar line that ran through the Coors Brewing Company. And Coors at that time, this was in the early 70s, they were trying to figure out how to ship beer over the mountains, over the Rocky Mountains into California, because it was a big untapped market. And so they were welding these pressurization systems into the boxcars. So he was literally spending his days, which is funny because his parents, my grandfather on my father's side, owned an automotive garage, and he had really encouraged my father. He's like, "Don't go to college, don't waste the money, like go get a welding certificate." So he ends up graduating from college with this degree, from the Kelley School of Business at IU, which great program. And welding boxcars, leading a crew welding boxcars. So he did that, while they were doing that project, but he made a friend with somebody who was also renovating these Victorian homes in what was then a kind of rundown part of South Denver, just north of the Capitol, which is now kind of the preeminent multifamily market. But back then it was, all these 100-year-old homes just falling apart, but they were subdividing them into apartments. So they were kind of taking a Victorian mansion and turning it into 6 or 8 units of apartments. And so that was his first entree into residential real estate, was actually renovating and then, selling these buildings as apartments. And so, the boxcar job wrapped up. It was a contract type job. And my mother's father was an LP investor in a tax loss harvesting deal. It was a project-based Section 8 property in a part of Dallas called Pleasant Grove, which, if you know anything about Dallas, it's neither pleasant nor much of a grove. But it was like 600 plus units of project-based Section 8, really bad part of town. But they had an open job for a maintenance supervisor. And so my grandfather kind of relayed that, and they ended up moving the family, which at that point was just the two of them, but ended up moving to Dallas, to Pleasant Grove, and he was a maintenance supervisor at this property. Within 3 months of coming into the property manager threw his keys on the desk and said, "Well, you can be the manager if you want, because these beeps don't pay their bills." And
he just became the manager.
And so that's how he became a property manager. And so he managed that property, and then he actually started his first property management business, Mattingly Real Estate Services, with that property as the kind of the first property in the portfolio, and took on that management contract and really built the property management business around that.
Wow. So he just completely fell into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's how most people do it.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So what is and then how did he start expanding from there?
So, as I mentioned, chaos presents opportunity. And one of the elements of the S&L crisis that followed, the change in tax laws around the way that income from residential real estate property was taxable, particularly depreciation, is that there was no capital available. Like, banks wouldn't lend because S&Ls were pretty much the only lender. They went out of business, and so there was nobody lending on apartments. And again, just sort of by happenstance, my mother's father's roommate in college was a bank president in Richmond, Indiana. So my father was talking to my grandfather about this, and he said, "Well, you should talk to my roommate." And talked to him and said, "Yeah, all right, I'll lend you money if you find us deals." And so they were able to start building an owned portfolio. Reputation grew, and so other folks who had found pockets or buckets of money here and there, who were able to buy deals in that late 80s, early 90s period, started hiring him to manage their properties as well. And so that's kind of how the portfolio started building.
I'm trying to think. Interest rates were really high. Right?
Interest rates were very
Extremely
high. Yeah.
So the math's still math, I guess. It still worked.
Well, yeah, I mean, if
because you're only managing, you're not.
Well,
you're buying as well.
We are buying as well, and if you're paying 10, 11, 12% interest, you got to have a 10, 11, 12% cap rate. And so they were buying these just really juicy cap rates.
So when you think about your dad and you, how are you guys like similar or different, I guess?
I would say we're more similar than different.
More similar than different.
Yeah.
Okay. And in what ways are you similar?
Well, one, my wife told me I can never shave my beard because otherwise I look too much like my father. So we look a lot alike. But, I think we have the same mannerisms, but also, I think one of the things that he has always done really, really well is be able to zoom in and zoom out very fast and kind of go from big picture to the macro level, to the micro level very quickly. And then, I think the other piece that we share is kind of the ability to then project out, okay, what is into the future. And I call that mental time travel. I think that's one of the core elements of strategic thinking, is the ability to say, okay, here are all of the environment factors I'm aware of. Here are all of the factors that I can control. This is how they're going to change over set time period, and the net result will be Y. And so I think that's it's teachable, but it helps to kind of have that modeled, and I've really benefited from having that modeled for a very long time.
Do you think that is the ability, because what I've noticed in my business is I also tend to, and I think maybe you have to, right? If you're starting a company, you have to be able to zoom in or zoom out. But I think if I were to choose where I spike naturally, it's zooming out. I think from both the fact that I enjoy it and just from a skill perspective. Do you feel like the ability to zoom in and zoom out is like a thing that people can learn, or is it just the way some people think?
I mean, I'm a big nerd, if that hasn't come across already. And, one of my passions is neuroscience, and, neuroplasticity is incredible. I think most things are teachable. I think people certainly have innate abilities that can influence how easy or difficult something is to learn, but I do think that most things are teachable, and that's certainly one of them.
What did you study in college?
So I actually started as a theater major, and then I was a psych major, and then I was the program at the time was called Radio, Television, and Film, and then I did pre-law. So everything, does that?
Yeah.
I did only take 2 math classes in college, but what was great, so I went to Northwestern, which is on a quarter system, which was great because I got to take more classes than traditional semester system, and I definitely took advantage of that.
So did school come naturally to you growing up?
Yeah, I would say academics were always a priority for me.
Both instilled by you and your parents, or just?
That's a good question. I definitely drove myself, and I don't know how to unpack how much of that was sort of parental expectation versus, inherent desire to excel.
Have you thought about it?
It doesn't really matter. I tend not to be somebody who dwells on things that are irrelevant. And that's one of those things in the past that the effect is what it is. Like it has already happened, and it's not something I have to worry about.
So we talked a little bit about how your initial taste of your dad being in property management wasn't positive as a kid.
Yeah.
When at some point, I imagine that changed because you got into the business. What was that? What was that like?
Kicking and screaming. No. So I was all set on being an entertainment attorney. I thought that was going to be like the perfect. Well, actually, what I wanted to do was I wanted to be a screenwriter. And then my junior year, I had a Emmy award-winning professor, a guy named David Tolchinsky, who kind of pulled me aside. We had 3 classes together. He pulled me aside and he said, I don't think you've suffered enough to write art. And he was right, by the way. I mean, I told you about my idyllic childhood. I really hadn't suffered. And, I would dispute a little bit whether it's necessary to really suffer to make great art. But at that point in time, he sort of redirected me to my plan B, which was to be an entertainment lawyer, because I could definitely write a legal brief. And I was in my legal communications class, which happened to be right next door to the American Bar Association. And a guy named Peter Glowacki came in, and he was friends with my professor. They were going to go out for drinks after the class. And he just sort of looked around the room and said, does anybody here know how to build a website? And I'd always had kind of an interest in technology. I was one of those, again, to use the word nerds, who I was on the online bulletin board servers with my 4600 baud modem, where you had to put the handset into the cradle, all the cool stuff. I had a CompuServe account when that came out. All the stuff. I was always very interested in computers, in networks, and the web in specific. So I raised my hand and said, I do. So he said, all right, come see me after class. And so I ended up landing an internship working in the continuing legal education department for the American Bar Association. Basically built their first e-commerce website. So this was back in the late 90s. And they were still kind of picking up the phone, and people were calling in with credit card numbers in order to process orders. None of their audio or video had been digitized. They were mailing people cassettes. It was definitely 10 years behind the times. And so I did that, and I thought I had found my passion. I was like, this is it. This is what I'm meant to do. Forget that real estate stuff. This is what I want to do. And followed a girlfriend to Colorado. I don't know why Colorado's factored so largely in my life, but followed a girlfriend to Colorado where she was going to go to law school, and ended up working in the car business. It was one of those jobs where, in my degree in electronic media management, nobody cared about that degree. That was not a marketable skill set. I didn't have a whole lot of a portfolio to build websites, and I didn't really want to build websites. I was more interested in sort of the business of technology than I was in the programming and stuff. So I ended up selling cars, and that's when my experience kind of growing up in the business really came in handy, because I had learned how to be a salesperson by leasing apartments. And so that really was very translatable and ended up being a pretty good car salesperson. And they gave me my own team. I was managing a team of 5 salespeople 3 months in because of that individual success. And then pretty soon they put me in charge of what they called business development, which was basically their in-house call center. And so I started running a call center. I started writing call center scripts. And then I was like, okay, well, we need an electronic CRM. We can't really keep all of this on paper anymore. And so I started doing CRM implementations. I worked with a company out of Houston called Traver Technologies. But the car business is challenging. The personalities can be challenging. And I was starting to kind of put feelers out there, and I ran into a guy named Jeff Hawks who had just started a new multifamily brokerage firm in Denver called Apartment Realty Advisors. It was part of a national network. They were basically going to the top multifamily brokers in each city, each major market, and kind of saying, all right, we'll help you start your own firm as part of this national network. And ended up being really successful, sold it to Grubb and Ellis, then became part of Newmark. But he's like, we need a tech guy. I understand what you're doing. I know your dad a little bit. I think he'd be a really good fit. And I came back and talked to my wife about it and agreed we would give it a shot. But I didn't want to just be the tech guy. I saw there was the money and the transaction side. And I said, I'll do it, but I need you to sponsor me for my broker's license so I can be a real estate broker. And that's how I got back into multifamily. It was kind of a full circle moment to come back in. And so I did that, implemented their CRM, became a research analyst, helped them open offices in Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and then became a broker and partnered with a wonderful mentor named Ken Green, who taught me so much about the business. And how to treat people as business associates. And started selling deals in Southern Colorado, primarily Colorado Springs.
What I'm really interested to understand is you've said a couple times that you're a self-proclaimed nerd.
Yeah.
How do you think about car sales and the intellectual curiosity you seem to have? Was that an issue? Where were you feeding your intellectual curiosity, I guess?
Well, continuing to advance my leadership journey, advance kind of my ability to work across generations. There's certainly an age gap between me and most of the other folks I was working with, and in many cases supervising. So that was certainly engaging. I think I've always been able to find ways to feed that intellectual curiosity, whether it be through researching neuroscience, or my wife is an incredible resource. She's multi-degreed, PhD candidate right now in educational psychology, and that's been a phenomenal relationship in terms of just feeding intellectual curiosity. We frequently get told to leave places when we're hanging out with friends because the conversation we're having is not the conversation they want to have. But
I love that. Where did you guys meet?
We actually met selling cars, ironically. So
was she the buyer?
No, she had been hired a month before. So her student loans came due. She was working at a head injury and rehab hospital, and her student loans came due because she'd been out for whatever it was, 5-6 years, and she was not able to make those payments on what they were paying at the hospital. So a friend of hers said, "Oh, you should try selling cars. You can make a lot of money that way, and pay off those student loans, and then get back to doing what you really love." And so she had been hired on the month before I started. They put me next to her and said, teach this guy how to do the paperwork. And she didn't know it then, but that was a pivotal moment for both of us.
I love it. So growing up, your dad started this company. Were you what was your position financially? Your upbringing? Were you considered wealthy? Were you middle class?
We went back and forth for sure. We were very much subject to the whims of the real estate cycle. We definitely had some of those, what I like to refer to as the powdered milk years, when things were tough. But I would say there were more ups than downs. And I think we had a pretty privileged upbringing. There were not many, 16, 17-year-olds that can boast, 4 or 5 countries on their passport, before age 18.
So where did you, with your family?
Yeah.
Did you travel a lot?
Yeah.
Where all did you guys go?
I mean, Mexico was a sort of a regular destination for Texans, particularly then. But went to France, Germany, the Netherlands.
Outside of work, where do you like to spend your time?
Where?
Yeah. What areas of what do you prioritize outside of work?
Well, certainly prioritize my family. That we're best friends. I've got 2 boys that are fantastic, very different, but both fantastic in their unique ways, and love to spend time with them. And then, of course, there's nobody I like more in the world than my wife. I love her, but I also like her more than anybody else. So love spending time with my family. And then as far as where we spend time together, that's less important. We do love to travel. We try to take at least one kind of good trip a year. And we really love the Pacific Northwest. That's sort of a preferred destination. But we've been all over the place.
And in terms of I guess where was not I didn't necessarily mean physically, just what hobby do you have any hobbies or anything like that you spend your time in?
I was recently talking about this with somebody that was telling me about his new woodworking hobby. And I said, how do you make time for a hobby? He's like, well, you literally do that. You have to make time for the hobby. And it's not something I've prioritized to date.
And honestly, if you were to ask me that question, I would struggle to answer.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, I think it's also okay to not have hobbies, to be honest with you. I think if you, in my opinion, I think simplifying my life is useful and easy. And if I have 2 or 3 buckets in my life where I want to spend my time, it just makes everything a lot more easier for me personally. So it's funny that I'm asking that question, because if somebody were to ask me that question, I couldn't answer it.
My wife and I like to do the spelling bee together in the New York Times puzzles, but that's probably the most hobby-ish thing that we do.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about your transition into Luma. So how long have you been with Luma for, and what was that transition in?
18 years. So I was working at the multifamily brokerage firm. I'd become a full broker at that point, and was doing pretty well. Started making sales, and was covering the minimum that I was required to do, and then some. And then this nasty thing called the Great Financial Crisis appeared on the horizon, and I was covering a market that was never really the strongest multifamily market. So Southern Colorado is predominantly Colorado Springs and Pueblo. Colorado Springs, a third of the renters are in the military, and they had really suffered from downsizing and then deployments to Afghanistan. And so kind of the southern region was not doing super well. And then Pueblo, which is now having a really cool renaissance, which is fun to see, but was sort of a old mining town that had never really picked back up since the late 19th century. So it was not a super robust market. It was a great market to learn in, but it was not super robust. And when we started seeing the warning signs, we had an in-house tenants in common firm when TIC strategies were first sort of coming to full maturity in the early 2000s. Partner firm called Frederick Ross built this company called Capital Real Estate, which was basically putting together these tenants in common via 1031 tax deferred exchange. And that was a bellwether, because we knew that was whatever happened, the TICs were going to be distressed first. And so when we started seeing the trouble in the TICs, I started looking for my plan B. So, plan B had originally been the real estate lawyer, then it was the car business, then it was being a multifamily broker, and I needed the next plan B. And so I was talking to my father about it, and he said, well, that property where you were a leasing consultant back in the 90s when we took over this deal, we're going to be doing a big renovation. Do you want to come back and kind of project manage through the renovation and learn that piece of the business? And I said, all right, well, I suppose it's not a bad thing to learn if all this broker BS I've been selling actually works. And it certainly would give me security with my 2-year-old and my relatively new wife. And so I moved them to Dallas in August of 2007, which for anybody out there who's thinking about moving to Dallas, don't do it in August, especially if your wife is not so sure about the transition. But we made it through and did the renovation, stayed on as property manager. And that's when I really figured out how cool this industry is.
What was your initial reaction working with did you have any resistance working with your father?
So we had layers. I mean, I worked initially I worked for a regional supervisor, and then that regional supervisor reported to an executive vice president, and that executive vice president reported to my father. So I'd say most of the initial resistance was just people figuring out, like, yes, he's the boss's son, but he's also his own person, and he's not going to rat on us, that sort of thing.
Did you feel the need to make sure that you were proving yourself?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I
because you didn't want to be the boss's son.
I did not, definitely. Still don't.
Yeah. Is your dad still active in the business?
Yeah, I mean, he's we could quibble about percentages, but 85% retired.
Okay.
But still, I mean, we were on a call just before before I headed over here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you, and what was this job that you started in? What was the?
So I was a property manager and a renovation project manager.
Renovation project. Okay.
Yeah.
So then what was the journey like to now you're the president?
Yeah.
What was that journey like?
What was it like? That's a very broad question.
What do you feel like made you climb all the way to being a president?
Well, like I said, I figured out it's actually a really cool industry. And what's so cool about it is, we're running these properties, these multi-million-dollar assets. We're running them essentially on a shoestring with very small teams, and we're delivering incredible returns to investors. Like, how cool is that to be able to take a team of 5, 7, 10 people and deliver, 2, 3, 3.5 multiples on invested capital and 25 internal rates of return. There's not many industries where you can do that. I mean, private equity is maybe the other one, but it takes a lot more people than it does to do that in multifamily. And leverage is part of the reason for that, for sure. But it also kind of points to the uniqueness of real estate as an asset class and multifamily specifically. I mean, the kinds of folks that we're dealing with are much different than the other real estate niches. And I think it's really cool. And for somebody who values the ability to zoom in and zoom out and kind of play things out in that mental time travel, that strategic thinking, it presents a lot of opportunities for me personally to do that. And so, like I said, I found out it was a cool business, and I get to be a financial analyst. I get to be a counselor. I get to be, a leadership speaker. I get to come do cool things like this. I mean, it provides an incredible number of opportunities.
What are the most challenging parts of the job?
I think with most jobs, the most challenging thing is having to balance the stakeholders' interests that sometimes conflict. So at Luma, we have a purpose statement that we exist because all companies exist to serve human needs, right? There's no reason for people to congregate except to serve human needs. And so our human needs, we're sort of balancing the human needs of our residents, of our employees, and our investors. And we have to be accountable to all of those stakeholders, but sometimes that means making decisions that advantage one stakeholder over the other. And I think that is the most challenging part of the job. And even as an on-site property manager, we have to do that. And that was the most challenging part of the job then. It's certainly the most challenging part of my job now. I don't think that changes. And I think because you're dealing with homes, it gets, I like to say there's the only industry that is more like personally impactful than housing is perhaps medicine. Because there's nothing more invasive than going into somebody's home.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you think about, I'm not sure if you know Melanie French, but we did a podcast a couple months ago, and one of the things she mentioned to me that stuck with me was the biggest decision you make as a consumer every year is where you're going to live. At least that's the largest wallet share.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of stuck with me to help me really understand the impact we have to people's lives, right? The impact you have as a property management company. You're really responsible for making sure that this person has a good living environment and situation. So.
Absolutely.
So on your LinkedIn, I was looking, and I saw in part of the description, best bosses in real estate.
Yeah.
If you were to boil that down to a couple things, what would other people say the reasons are?
Well, one of the reasons why I value that award so much is it is an award that was given to me by my team, by the people I work with. You know, they had to respond to the survey and you know, say nice things about me, and I didn't pay them to do that because it was anonymous, and I wouldn't know if they didn't. So I really value that and appreciate it for that reason. But you know, what I think people say about me is that I bring a unique sort of level of vision to the table, and that I am transparent in communicating the vision, but I'm not dogmatic about the vision, that I am open to better ideas and will frequently change course when somebody presents data or alternative opinions that are superior to mine.
Do you think it's possible to be a good boss while not being liked?
I think it depends on the industry. So I think it would be very hard to be unlikable and be successful doing what I do. I think being able to build rapport with people, and you know, I think it's okay to have a little bit of a remove, but I think if you're just despised, nobody wants to follow you. They certainly don't want to spend time with you. So if there's success, it's in spite of you, not because of you.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked the question is when you look at, there's this book called The Courage to be Disliked. I don't know if you've heard of it or read it.
Yeah.
But when I think about a lot of the decisions that I sometimes have to make and how my decision-making process has evolved, it has evolved actually, candidly, from how do I make people like me to how do I do what's right for the company. And sometimes those things are at odds. If you're going to have to do a big layoff, you almost can't walk away. You will not walk away from that being liked 100%.
Sure.
And the reason why I asked that question is I think it's challenging. And it really, I wonder if those two things are at odds, because I have as you do, I have a duty to my investors. I have a duty to the company to make sure this succeeds. And while I want to do that, and I hope to do that while being liked, that's not necessarily what I feel like I have to optimize for.
Yeah.
So when I think about like that award, it made me think like, could those two things live in the same award? Could you not be liked, and could you also be a great boss? And the answer is probably yes, because if you look at Steve Jobs, he was incredibly like disliked by a lot of the people that worked for him. But when they look at that in hindsight, almost everybody that's worked for Steve Jobs has said that they have never had a work experience that even comes close to that, which I think is interesting. So it's like do you want people to like you, or do you want them to have the best working experience and grow the most? I don't know. Maybe the goal is to ideally do those both, but it's just something I think about.
Well, what I find is the people that want to be liked are often the least liked. And I think that people are generally quite intuitive when it comes to interpersonal reactions and the nuance of communication. And so if your goal from every interaction is to be liked, that comes across as desperate. And desperation, one, is not sexy, but it is also usually a cover for something else, some other thing that's going on. And so I don't think seeking to be liked as a goal is very effective. I think seeking to be a good person, to be open to explaining oneself is really key. And I think that does two things. If you're open to explaining yourself, one, it helps people understand that the things that you're doing are not mercurial, they're not reactive, they're not a personal attack or affront. But two, it gives them, insight into your human struggle and humanizes you. And so I think those two things inherently, we're social animals. We are predisposed, for the most part, there's exceptions to every rule, but we're predisposed to like each other. And so if you just create the opening for that to happen, even when you make unpopular decisions, just explain it.
What advice would you give to your younger self if you were just starting out your career?
I've been asked this question before, and I mentioned earlier that I'm not somebody who likes to kind of retread old tires. So I struggle with it a little bit.
Why do you not? So you said that this is the second time you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Why do you not like it? Do you feel like it's not beneficial?
Yeah, I don't think it's productive. I am a big believer in self-reflexivity as the key driver of self-development. And once I've done that reflexivity, revisiting the process doesn't change anything going forward. It's sort of wasted cycles. So, what I mean by that is when I'm about to embark on a project or when I'm in the midst of a project, I'm constantly evaluating what are the environmental factors, what is our progress? Are we achieving targets? Are we not achieving targets? How can we course correct? And so that is a process that, is fairly taxing. It's intellectually engaging, but it's a taxing process. And then to go back and revisit something that happened, a decade ago, where I've already done that practice, I've learned the lessons that needed to be learned, I've put them into practice where possible. Going back to revisit that is not something that particularly interests me. And it drives my wife crazy because she loves to play what if games. She's like, oh, what if this happened? What if that happened? But it didn't. I don't know. It's, we all have our own neuroses. I guess that's mine.
Being in the industry for so long, you've clearly had a front row seat to how the industry has evolved. Where do you think the next 5 years are going with AI and AI's involvement in property management? What do you think is going to happen if you were to have a couple hot takes or predictions?
Well, you also have a great front seat to answer this question. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I'll tell you what I think. It's a very exciting time. As you saw, I sit on the board. I'm a board director for an AI startup. And we've been chipping away at this for 5 years. So we were kind of an early mover in the multifamily side to implement a lot of different kinds of AI, the NLP, the OCR, but also, large language models, conversational chat. And it's been really gratifying to see some of the bets we made start to pay off. And some of the clients that said, oh, this is too pie in the sky, you're never going to make it work, come back and say, oh, this is game changing for us. But I think as far as, what is the next 5 years, I think the pace of change has accelerated tremendously. And the interest level and capital that is flowing to innovative technologies in our space is, bigger than it's ever been. Doesn't mean it's easy to raise money. It's certainly harder to raise money than it was 3 or 4 years ago. But the folks that are raising money, have a good thesis, have product market fit, are raising tremendous sums of money and being very successful and driving further innovation in the verticals that they're engaged in. And I think it'll be interesting to see which of these firms that have sort of floated to the top in terms of fundraising, but also product market fit, which ones sort of become institutionalized and see the innovation curve start to bend downwards, and which ones are able to deploy that capital, but also have the vision for building something new on top of that. So I think there's going to be a real bifurcation in the space. But in terms of technologies that I'm excited about in the next 5 years, robotics, bar none. We're already seeing this. I avidly watch consumer electronics because what's in the single family world today is what's going to be in multifamily tomorrow. And seeing what's in the space as far as cleaning, as far as laundry, as far as construction.
Groundskeepers. And do you think we're going to get to a world in which, well, I think the answer is probably yes eventually, but maybe how soon we get to a world where properties will be peopleless?
Oh, well, it's already happened, depending on certain size and scale, between automation, centralization, and not so much robotics yet, although there's some robotics and AI access control. You could call that robotic or robotic process automation. You're already seeing that. The big REITs in every REIT call last quarter were talking about their centralization and automation efforts, their centralized leasing offices, their shared services teams, all of those kinds of things. So that's happened. Has that trickled through? No. We're such a fractional industry. It's very hard for trends to sort of trickle out through the entire industry just because there's so many individual owners driving decision making. But I would say that's fait accompli and it's table stakes, frankly, for sophisticated operators.
Because you have exposure to AI, being involved in a company and just being in the industry, where do you feel like tech companies are not building enough tooling to help property management companies?
I love that you are asking this question. I try to, when I'm being pitched a product or looking at a new product, I always try to insert this. So I love being asked because I'm usually not. I think there's a couple things. One is, there's so many tools out there that are really focused on the upper end of the sales cycle, the leasing funnel. And what the problem is, they, for the most part, can't take a prospect all the way through. And so they have to do a handoff. And with maybe one exception, that handoff is really bad. And so that's a really key missing link to make pretty much all of these products focused on the sales piece better, is do a better job of making that handoff seamless, integrating into the places where people are already working, making that work visible. And it's somewhat about the agentification of AI, right? So it needs to be a coworker, kind of not something that lives outside of the work environment. And so that's a real opportunity, is to make that sales-focused AI an agent, within your existing platform. So that's one. I also think that there's still a lot that can be done around the data that we collect and aggregate, and data transformation. I did a talk probably 5, 6, 7 years ago at a small retreat for multifamily leaders. And I said that if Google can create bots that go out and collect data and put it into tabular form to make the whole World Wide Web accessible, why can the multifamily industry not have bots that go and crawl the 17 different pieces of software that we're using to implement our business and translate that into our independent data layer. Instead, we have to work through ETLs and, these data transformations, and, it's millions of dollars to create your independent data layer. I think that's just absolutely ripe for disruption, and with existing tools would not be hard to do.
I love that. Yeah, I love both of those points. It's funny that you brought up number one, because that's exactly what we started the company to solve.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the companies that have used other tools that have switched over to us.
That's why I said maybe one.
Okay. Yeah. I was like, wow, you're stealing the words out of my mouth. But the way we've solved that in the interim is we actually have our own internal human team that will pick up conversations, because exactly this issue, when you hand it off. Also, if I was a leasing agent, like, I would want the problem to be completely solved.
Yeah.
And if I'm a leasing agent and most of the conversations are happening after hours or on weekends, if you have a handover, they're not going to respond.
Right.
And the person that responds, the company that responds first, is the one that's going to win.
Yeah.
So I think exactly right, which is why we're solving similar to Bob AI. We started 4 years ago, and I remember the sentiment, because this is, I mean, you know what it was like before generative AI, and everybody was, we were talking to all these investors, and they were like, oh, so you're building a chatbot, and it was just so annoying because there was no verbiage for this. And now everybody's talking about AI, but in 2020 and 2021, it wasn't talked about. So
and cool. we were selling to government and quasi-governmental organizations too. So I mean, that's what we do, is we take these complex regulatory environments and we try to boil it down into a conversational exchange and data collection. So that's the use case that we're trying to, or the pain point that we're trying to solve, and using AI to do it. And so it's very similar in that regard, that it's still difficult. Don't get me wrong, it's still difficult to sell to government, but at least the language is there. You're right.
Ian, I want to thank you for being on the show. This was really great, and I feel like people are going to get a lot of value out of this. So thanks for coming over.
Well, I certainly feel like I've enjoyed the time and appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks.